Welcome to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Kessner.
My name is Claire Kaplan.
And I'm Emily Wang.
And today we are lucky to have a wonderful guest, Taryn Evans, who is going to share her story with us. Welcome, Taryn. Could you give us a little bio about yourself? Tell us who you are.
Yes, happy to, and honored to be speaking with you today. I was born and raised in Salt Lake City, Utah. That's where I am still based out of. I have a large family, 10 siblings, counting my in-laws siblings and parents and wonderful husband, 2 stepsons and 2 Yorkies that I love dearly. I currently practice law in Salt Lake City. And that's kind of a brief overview of who I am.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And so tell us about your story. What brings you to the podcast today?
So in 2019, I had just started dating again. My first husband had passed away when I was 28. And when I started dating again, about 6 months in, using dating apps, I met an individual that I talked to on an app. We shared our phone numbers, talked on the phone. I agreed to go on a date to get hot chocolate. And that night, he sexually assaulted and raped me. And so I made it through. I did report right away. And I've kind of made it through the criminal justice system in Utah. And following an outcome I wasn't happy with, I decided to share my story. And so, I agreed to get hot chocolate. And the man, he convinced me to break my rule and let him come pick me up at my home address, even though I had a rule that I would only meet in public. He told me that his mom had raised him right and pretty much guilted me into allowing him to pick me up. And then when he got to my house, he parked somewhere I couldn't see his car even. And he was coming to my door and said, "Well, wait, can I meet your adorable dogs?" And so I agreed. And then when he was in my house, he said, "Can I have a glass of water?" And at that point, I wasn't very comfortable with what was happening. So I kind of said, "I thought we were going to get hot chocolate. Why don't we leave?" And he then sat down in my house. And I was trying to not be rude, so I sat with him on a couch and we spoke. I had no attraction to this man. To describe him, it looked like he had just come from a gym. He smelled like mildew. He had these really creepy white shoes on that were dirty. And I was trying to find a way to invite him to leave. And at one point I was super relieved because he stood up and he walked towards my front door. And I thought, great, he's leaving. Instead, he turned off the lights. And that's when he started the assault by forcibly grabbing my hands and then, forcing a kiss. And then he dragged me into my bedroom and he sexually assaulted me and raped me for about 45 minutes before he got up and finally left my house.
Wow, that's a frightening story and horrifying in so many ways. I'm wondering, you talked about how you were trying to be nice and that you were not comfortable, and it's like he was pushing all your boundaries, but sort of guilt-tripping you. Would that be a good description?
Yes, absolutely. And I just felt like every time I was trying to say that, let's go get our hot chocolate, let's do what we planned, he was just prepared with a way of saying something to the effect of, I'm a good guy, why are you acting like I'm not? And so I had a bad feeling in my gut. But I was raised in the main religion in Salt Lake and really taught to be kind to others. And it was really hard for me to think it would be unkind to tell him just to get out of my house, even though that's what my gut wanted to tell him.
I'd like to get back to that point a little later about the whole notion of sort of culture or religious culture that makes us go against our natural instincts. So I'll try to remember to ask you about that in a little bit. But so how were you feeling? Do you recall how you felt when you realized where this was going?
I do. I was terrified. He had used a different name and then showed me he had a concealed carry permit with his actual name and told me something like, "I always carry." And so when the assault started, I froze beyond just trying to talk him out of it. I verbalized no as many ways as I could. And then, saying, "I'm not ready for this. This is too fast. Do not want to do this. Maybe if I saw you again and got to know you, I'd want to do this." And I was just terrified. Other than using my words. I froze. I did not know if he had a gun. I had no way of knowing. I mean, even if it wasn't on his person, it could easily be in his car. And he knew where I lived, obviously. And I was worried, which is kind of funny, about my dogs too, because they're my fur babies. I didn't want him to do anything to hurt them. So I froze and continued to say no. It got especially terrifying because he had me pinned down on my own bed naked, and he was naked, and he was yelling at me to say yes, I'm not a rapist, and just yelling that at me. And then when I said I'm not comfortable doing this and I wouldn't say yes, even though he was yelling at me, he eventually just looked at me and he said, well, I don't need consent to knock on the door. And I was horrified to learn that meant he would, not to be too graphic, but take his genitalia and knock it on mine. And he said he didn't need consent to do that. And eventually, even though I wouldn't say yes, he just went into the full rape. And I don't know that I disassociated entirely. I was aware of what was happening because I was verbally trying to end it as fast as I could, saying, aren't you done yet? Anything I could think of. But I do remember he was yelling at me a lot because I wouldn't look at him. I was looking at the ceiling and I could see the top of his forehead and his eyebrows. And so his eyebrows are something that are actually a trigger for me. If anyone has eyebrows like him, since that's what I stared at most of the assault, it doesn't matter if I'm in an airplane, someone has unique looking eyebrows, I will feel like it's him and have a complete, panic attack. So,
and the notion that looking at someone's eyebrows, just the shape of someone's eyebrows or color of someone's eyebrows can be enough to be a trigger. So often we talk about these issues on our podcast about what triggers can be. And it can be the weather. It could be a smell. It could be the light, in the environmental light. It could be so many different things. And here you're talking about just a tiny sliver of someone's face is enough.
Yes. And that ends up being a trigger that is really hard to work with because I can't control what people's eyebrows look like, or I can't help that when I look at someone in the eyes, you see their eyebrows. Another major trigger for me is the dark. I can't sleep in the dark still because the assault started with him turning off all the lights.
I just want to say that, I think I understand kind of where you're coming from because I think I have a very similar experience when it comes to dating, especially that I think you want to put yourself out there and that sort of initial excitement to be, finally put yourself out there and then to have someone take advantage of not only your sort of trust or this sort of eagerness that you might have to finally engage and connect with other people, but also the taking advantage of kindness, which is always, I think, such a difficult thing to sit with. I do, I guess, want to ask you a little bit more about what the process was like afterwards, kind of the aftermath, as well as how you approached sort of actually having him leave, as well as any sort of justice you sought after.
Yeah. So basically he finished doing everything he wanted to do and he stood up and walked out of my house and I waited about 2 seconds and then I ran and locked my door and then spent probably a half hour scrubbing my body. I felt, and I think this connects to my community and my religion, I felt that I was ruined. It wasn't just that this is a horrible thing. It was that I could never be clean again and nobody would want me. And my initial reaction was really bad. When I scrubbed myself with a loofah or a pumice stone in areas you shouldn't and got out of the bath and still felt this dirtiness and could still smell the mildew, even though I knew I'd washed myself. My mental health went to the very lowest point in my life. And it was only because I was just happened to decide to call the suicide hotline. And they connected me with a local rape recovery center, and an advocate there kind of guided me to decide whether I wanted to report or not. And then when I decided I wanted to, they did meet me at the hospital so that I had someone there for the SANE exam and for the initial reporting to the police. So I did make that decision to report, not really knowing what that would entail. And at the same time, I still had those really bad self-images that I was ruined. And sadly, my support group at the time, made up mainly of my family, they were not prepared in any capacity to hear me break the news when I wanted to share. And their approach to it actually made my self-blame be much worse than it started out, because I felt bad that I'd given my address. And I didn't understand that that didn't mean it wasn't my fault. And my family kind of reinforced that it was my fault. I was too smart and too educated to let that happen to me. And I was acting reckless by doing that. And so this is what happens if you do that. And I was very ashamed, felt very ruined and dirty, felt very alone. And even, my most trusted work mentor told me, well, don't talk about this. It will ruin your legal career. And so every message I got outside of that rape recovery center was, don't even talk about this. How could you have let that happen? It's going to, this is your fault. This makes you look like you're not smart enough to be an attorney and you're reckless. And how could you do that? And so I spiraled pretty bad for a few months with that. And I knew my family loved me, but 5 days after the rape, my mom and my sisters, who I'm close with, held an intervention claiming that I was acting so reckless that this is why it happened. And so that set back, that I spent probably a year in trauma therapy just trying to convince myself that it wasn't my fault and that rape happens to people and sexual assault, no matter who you are, where you are. It isn't this idea that it's only in the dark alley and you're not smart, you're being not smart to walk past a dark alley by yourself. That it could happen in my own home with someone who I literally had only agreed to get hot chocolate with.
That just sounds so traumatic and so difficult with the people you expect to support you. You said you were in therapy and just to deal with that issue. Then you've got the original issue as well. What else helped you, or have you gotten through that feeling, the feeling of shame, the feelings that you have that people put on you and that you put on yourself? What has worked for you, if at all?
So I've spent the last 4.5 years doing different kinds of trauma therapy. I would say the initial type that helped me a lot was to do exposure therapy. Very hard work, very intensive, it's horrible to do, but I can now talk about what happened to me because we focused on the trigger of talking about the experience as being one of my main goals that I wanted to be able to do. And part of that was because of the criminal case that was ongoing. I wanted to be able to testify without it breaking me. And the secondary part of that was a lot of trauma therapy about the realities of rape, not the perceptions that people in my life had about rape. And I had to break it down like line by line. What was the interaction with, I call him the bad guy, with the bad guy that led to him getting into my house. And my therapist had to point out that's him preying on knowing your upbringing and that you want to be nice. Oh, that's him doing it again. Like pointing out every step he took instead of the steps I took, because he was the one initiating each of these ideas. My idea was to meet at a place to get hot chocolate in public, but he kept coming at me with these ideas. And when I was pushing back in it, as much as I felt like I could, being kind, then, my therapist showed me that he was really targeting that kindness and was using that as a way in. And so that therapy that I did with that trauma therapist was amazing, because despite my, the difficulties I had talking to my family, I had to put up barriers and protect myself from those conversations because they were big setbacks in my recovery. But having a really good trauma therapist was just life-saving for me. And then as time went by, I switched to doing trauma therapy and integration therapy with ketamine. Mm-hmm. And ketamine is so hard to explain, but I can say that the ketamine has helped me immensely. And the biggest thing that it's done for me has been a reminder of how much my brain and my body loves me and loves myself, and that I'm not ruined. And I think I can't explain really what ketamine looks like, but that's usually the message that comes through in each of the sessions I do. And then the integration therapy is really important because you go through these really important and valuable concepts that you feel while you're on ketamine, and you can integrate them into your life. Like, how does this help you? And I also have to say that I did meet my husband, I want to say 4 months after the assault, and he's been fantastic. He has education involving specifically for sports, but kind of the mental side game for sports. And so he's very understanding and patient with me dealing with trauma. He's the one that finds me hiding under shoes in a closet when I've had an episode because I'm trying to hide from the bad guy. So he's been there. He's been non-judgmental, supportive of whatever therapy. And, he'll protect me from anyone who's trying to victim blame or shame me. And that's been key. I feel very lucky that I found him, especially given what was going on in that moment. But I would say that I've had amazing trauma therapists and doctors I've worked with, and it's made a huge difference and repaired that like self-love, self-image, and also reinforced that this is absolutely not my fault. He would have found a way even if I met him in public. He wanted to do what he wanted to do, and it wasn't my fault that he wanted to commit a crime against me.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So a couple of questions come up. One is, you talked about having your sort of panic reactions when you're feeling fearful, and I'd like to know what that feels like and what you do to, in addition to which is wonderful that your husband helps you through this, but before you had him, how did you pull yourself out of those, if you could? And my second question is about your husband. So first, let's talk a little bit about the sort of reactions you have when you're feeling particularly fearful. Do you mind talking about that at all?
Yeah, of course. So I have pretty good case of hypervigilance. He told me he drove a white car. So if I'm driving on the freeway and I feel like I'm surrounded by white cars, which that's a very common color for a car, I'll start having those panic. I'll feel like someone's following me. My heart will start racing and I'll start hyperventilating. And initially, the person that I actually would turn to would be my dad. He's funny. He doesn't want to get into details about what happened, but if I call him, he's really good at distracting me with something very random. And that would usually be my go-to and would pull me out of that panic. But there still were moments where I would have a flashback, and those are the times when I would find myself like bawling and not know exactly how I got to my car or how I got in a closet or someplace that I thought I was hiding. And those only got better as I worked on the exposure therapy, and we worked on things like the smell of mildew, not a fun thing to expose yourself to on purpose, but that was helpful. Actually looking up pictures of cars is exposing me to white cars, just looking at them and seeing they're not doing anything to me. Those were the exposure therapy, and then kind of the randomness of my dad, whatever. He would just say something really random and that made no sense. And that would just, like, my brain would bounce back and be like, what? And then I would be pulled kind of out of that panic state.
That's cool. How great that your dad could do that for you. So how did your husband respond when you told him about what happened? But also, what does he do that helps you through your recovery?
Yeah, so I definitely disclosed to him. I actually tried to ask him a few months ago. I was like, when did I tell you? And I think it was our second or third date, because I was in the middle of exposure therapy, which was a huge time commitment. And I just wanted him to know that I might have issues with intimacy until I work through some things. And he just was, expressed that he felt bad that happened to me. It should never happen. The man should never do that to a woman. And kind of just stepped in and made me feel like he was really protective of me early on. And like I said, he has been really patient when there have been like setbacks because of something going on in the criminal case or just the healing process, which is not like linear. It's not like after 6 months, you're to phase 3 of trauma. Mm-hmm. Any little thing can pull me back without, there's some triggers that I still can't identify exactly, like, well, what made me do that? And he's just patient. And when he sees me, he kind of protects me from anyone. He'll close the door. He'll tell people that I'm just not well enough to hang out anymore. And so he, and then if we're on an airplane, it's happened more than once, and I see someone, their eyebrows, look a certain way, he'll do breathing exercises with me, tension exercises, kind of a full body check-in, even if we're on an airplane. And that will help me make it through the moment and realize, yes, that person looks nothing like him. It's just the eyebrows. And it's his training is just really helpful for when you're not in trauma therapy. He has good skills to use to help me through a bad moment.
That's awesome. What is his background? You said he has the skills.
So he got a master's. I always forget, but it's similar to sports psychology.
Okay.
So yeah, that's where he did all of the psychology type classes, and he's actually learned more with working with me. He's been willing to learn what my trauma therapists recommend, and so it's not just his background. He's also willing to learn and listen and help me in ways that I ask him to.
That's awesome. Well, and of course, I'm sure it's adding to his arsenal as a professional, the kinds of things that he may need to use, with other
absolutely
clients. So pretty cool.
I think you've mentioned this a little bit, that there is a legal case. What has that process been like for you, particularly since you mentioned that your community and your religious background is not super open to, I think they tend to be very blaming of you. Is there, what has that process been like, and how has your community reacted to that legal case?
So I would say initially that sex in general is just a taboo subject. And so you have an inability to talk about sex. And so sex is sexual assault is even worse. Nobody wants to talk about that. And so there's just not a lot of conversations happening, and that makes you feel very isolated. And the criminal case, it was super slow. I joked with somebody, I was like, if he had stolen my iPhone after assaulting me, you guys would have arrested him that night because of stolen property. But they waited over 2 months to interview him. And then I was told I was very lucky because they did charge him with 3 felonies. But the case took 4.5 years. It was continued 7 times by the request of the defense team. And then we lost 2 trial dates at the request of the defense team. And at one here, I was on my 11th prosecutor because of the turnover in the district attorney's office where it was being prosecuted. I knew what was going on mostly because I had the ability as an attorney to look it up myself. There was not any real good communication coming back and forth. I showed up to court one time and the defense asked, it was the second trial date that got canceled. We had a substitute judge that day. No prosecutor showed up. The defense just said, we think our other case scheduled next week has more, it should take the priority. They didn't explain why. The substitute judge struck the trial date, and there was no one there from the state to do anything. And so that was really frustrating. I had to fight for them to get a special date set where the defense couldn't set other trials for the same time to avoid the same thing happening again. And about 2 business days before trials to start in February, the defense team gave an offer to the district attorney's office, which would be to plead to misdemeanors for sexual battery instead of the 3 first-degree felonies, and no sex offender registry, lifetime protective order to me, 3 years of private probation, and restitution. And that offer was presented to me, and initially it was my decision. And I just said, I've never counted anything in my healing process to have anything to do with the conviction, but I have tied it to being able to face him at trial and testify. And that was part of what I was planning on, and I was willing to take the risk of acquittal. And they said, we'll sleep on it and we'll talk tomorrow. The next day I said, I haven't changed my mind. I did all the prep work with my therapist. I'm ready to testify in a few days. And, I would like to do that. And over my objection, they entered into the plea deal with the bad guy. And I had to state my objection to the judge before the plea was accepted. And then I got to read a victim impact statement that literally had no ability to have impact because of the plea deal they made. And so that process was long, frustrating, discouraging. And the message was, well, the way our laws are written, my case was good because he admitted that I said no over and over again. But once an offer was made, my case had a substantial likelihood of acquittal all of a sudden. And they just said, we want to get him on something instead of nothing. And I said I was objecting because the whole point I went through it was to protect other women, not myself. So the lifetime protective order doesn't do anything for other women. And I said that, I'm objecting because I want him on the registry. And the response from the male prosecutor was, well, women don't look at people on the registry. That doesn't matter at all. And then when I mentioned, well, I know that in 3 years he can ask to reduce the charges even more. And then 2 years later, he can ask to have them fully expunged off his record like it never happened. And their response was, well, we would fight that and we'll win that fight. But they weren't willing to go to trial. And I said, what else could I have done as a victim? I reported within hours. I showed up and did the same exam that night. Wasn't under the influence of anything. I cooperated the whole time. He admitted that I said no. Like, what else could I have done as a victim? The answer was nothing. And that basically, if I had broken bones, because I had fought back physically instead of freezing, then they could have taken it to trial. But they didn't want to take it to trial because I froze. And our statute is written in a way that the prosecutor believed that because I froze, it wouldn't be enough to show that there was not consent.
Oy, oy, oy. So it sounds like 20 years ago in some jurisdictions. Can I ask, are you in Salt Lake City per se, or are you outside?
I'm in Salt Lake. I live and work directly in Salt Lake.
So this is the major city in Utah, and they still didn't have the folks who were willing to pursue real prosecution of this guy.
Right. And my fear was the implication is you're not going to prosecute a rape case. You're going to take it to trial. And so I've started work. That's what actually led to me deciding to tell my story. I was sick of waiting for someone else to do anything. So I went public first to everyone on my social media. And since then, I've gone as public as I can. And I'm working with people in Utah, legislators, someone from the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, to change our law to be, I've rebranded it as a only yes means yes statute, because I don't know why, but Republicans in Utah don't like the phrase affirmative consent. So that is what was identified as the reason they wouldn't try my case. And so I'm putting energy into trying to change the law.
Awesome, because that was going to be my next question. And I bet, Emily, you were thinking the same thing. And Elizabeth Smart, I mean, the foundation's a wonderful organization, and she has done amazing work as an advocate.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think will be happening? I mean, do you think there's a good chance that legislation will be brought forth and that it will be supported?
So there is a representative that's had a bill for the last 4 years. It's changed a little, but this last session in January, it was tabled and there were no public hearings, no discussion. And so I've paired up with researchers at the University of Utah, the representative that's had the bill. And like I said, her name is Mio Strong from the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, and other people in the community. I have constituents. I have a group of lawyers and prosecutors. And so I'm confident that we will bring a lot of discussion, a lot of attention. We have media attention from 2 different Salt Lake-based news outlets. The stories haven't run yet, but one runs tomorrow and the other one will be in a couple of weeks. So I know there'll be coverage, and I know that I will force conversation at the next session. I have a really dedicated group of people that is coming together. And so I don't know what will happen with the law. That I'm working to meet with different legislatures to try to get more support from the Republican side, because it's a Democratic representative that's brought the bill. And so we need more from the other party. So I'm trying to meet with as many as I can between now and January but I'm confident that it won't be just tabled. There'll be too much attention on it.
Well, good luck with that. I hope that keep us posted on how that goes. Emily, do you want to ask some questions?
Yeah, I guess as we sort of get deeper into your healing and what you've now done to advocate for yourself as well as for others, what would you say is the most, an important piece of wisdom that you've gained over the past, few years working through therapy as well as, in advocating for this legal process? What would you say is a really, important piece of wisdom that you'd like to share with our audience today?
I think the biggest lesson I've learned is the most important thing is for people to start talking. Nothing can change for survivors or to prevent if we don't talk about it. And so I think that anyone that listens, you may not be ready to share your story, but you can wear a pin and you can wear teal in April and you can support the movement without sharing a story. I can say that once I went public, I've had so many people that I know reach out to me and say, this happened to me. I'll share my story. And so sometimes you don't realize how many people are affected and how many people will get behind you if you're willing to speak up, because I do believe that people really care and they don't want people sexually assaulted. But if we don't have conversations about it, nothing is going to change. Victims are not going to start feeling supported instead of blamed or feeling ashamed, because the message that I never got the message of it's not your fault from anyone other than my therapists and doctors. And it would have been so nice to get that from religious leaders, from community friends, from my family especially. And so I think that my family had talked about it more, that it might have been very different for my healing process. I would have had them. But I think if you're willing to talk about it, whether it's your story or just supporting the movement of let's make the laws better, let's make awareness better, let's make prevention better, I think that's the biggest thing I learned. And then I can also say that the only time I've felt empowered in this whole process, nothing in the legal process made me feel empowered. But the second I started talking to people, the second I started testifying at the Capitol in Utah, I felt empowered. Like my story could do something and people listen. They can't just dismiss you because that's what really happened to me. And it's been very difficult, as can be a lifelong thing I have to deal with. And for now that I'm owning my story, I feel empowered to use it to help other people. Like I'm not wanting to talk to a bunch of news outlets because of myself. I want less people to feel the way I felt. I want other survivors to feel support. And I want to prevent the need. I want people to be empowered that no is not rude. If your gut says no, you can say no. And I think without having discussions in every community, we're going to have the same people preying on kindness of all things, which is horrible. So I think, talking about it, and also the note that I, for the first time, feel empowered by sharing my story.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Taryn. This has been a great interview, and you've provided such inspiration, I think, to our listeners.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and to have another outlet to share my story. Again, it feels empowering because maybe one person will feel a little bit better if they've gone through some of the things I've gone through.
Mm-hmm. Emily, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to really sort of thank you for sharing that. That's what we're doing here today, of course, is talking and sharing. And it's so important to just keep talking about it. Don't be afraid to say that this happened to me or this is not okay. And so long as we keep talking, then change happens. So thank you so much for sharing your story and truly for advocating, not only for yourself, but for so many others out there. And thank you to our listeners for listening and, of course, sharing and supporting the cause, that if we never stop talking, then that's how change happens. So thank you so much, Taryn, for your wonderful interview and your great thoughts today. Claire, any final thoughts?
None from me. I just want to thank you again, Taryn, and thank you to our listeners for joining us.
Thank you.
So long, everyone.
Thank you for joining another episode of the Dear Katie podcast. We look forward to welcoming all of our survivors, supporters for another episode in the coming week. Please continue to take good care of yourself. Together we will shatter the silence and end the violence.